"Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom?" My millionaire son asked with a warm smile as he wrapped his arms around me beneath the glow of a 20-foot Christmas tree. And in that single moment, the entire holiday seemed to freeze around me. I blinked and looked up at Ethan, certain I had misheard him. The laughter in the ballroom continued. Christmas music drifted softly from hidden speakers, and waiters carried trays of sparkling cider and appetizers between groups of well-dressed guests. Yet all I could focus on was the question hanging in the air between us. "What $5,000? I asked quietly. Ethan's smile faded. His hands loosened from my shoulders. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face. Then I noticed someone else. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood only a few feet away beside the dessert table. A crystal glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the polished floor. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Vanessa forced a laugh and apologized to nearby guests, but I could see the color draining from her face. I had known Vanessa for 8 years. She was always composed, always polished, always in control. Yet at that moment, she looked frightened. "Mom," Ethan said carefully, lowering his voice. "The monthly support payments. The money I've been sending you." I stared at him. The words made no sense. Monthly support payments? I lived in a small 2-bedroom house outside Columbus. My furnace was older than some of my neighbors. Last winter, I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save money. I clipped grocery coupons every Sunday and drove a 12-year-old sedan with a heater that worked only when it felt like cooperating. If someone had been sending me $5,000 every month, I certainly would have noticed. "Ethan," I said, trying to smile so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of his guests. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." He looked genuinely puzzled. "There can't be. I set everything up 3 years ago." 3 years. The number landed heavily in my chest. 3 years ago was shortly after my husband Harold passed away. 3 years of struggling to stretch every dollar. 3 years of telling myself that Ethan was busy building his company and living his own life. 3 years of believing I needed to handle things on my own. Around us, the Christmas party slowly resumed. Guests returned to their conversations. A jazz version of Silent Night floated through the room. Outside the enormous windows, fresh snow covered the grounds of Ethan's estate like a postcard scene. Everything looked perfect, yet something beneath that perfect surface suddenly felt very wrong. Vanessa approached us carrying a fresh drink. Her smile looked practiced. "Everyone's waiting for the family photo," she said quickly. "Why don't we talk business another time?" Ethan never took his eyes off me. "It's not business." Vanessa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "Tonight is Christmas Eve," she replied. "Let's not ruin the evening." Ruin the evening. The phrase echoed in my mind. Because for some reason, the person who seemed most worried about this conversation wasn't Ethan. It was Vanessa. I looked at her carefully. Small details I might have ignored before suddenly stood out. The tension around her eyes. The way she avoided looking directly at me. The forced brightness in her voice. Then Ethan pulled out his phone. "Mom," he said softly, opening an app. "I can show you the transfers right now." Vanessa's expression changed completely. For the first time since I had known her, I saw genuine panic flash across her face. And standing there beneath thousands of Christmas lights, surrounded by luxury, music, and holiday cheer, I realized that somebody had been hiding something from me for a very long time. I just didn't know yet how much my life was about to change. That night, I barely slept. The images from the Christmas party replayed in my mind over and over again. Ethan standing there with genuine confusion. Vanessa struggling to hide her panic. The look on her face when he mentioned showing me the transfers. By midnight, I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, wrapped in an old cardigan, staring at the small ceramic Christmas village I had displayed every December since Harold was alive. The tiny houses glowed softly beneath the string lights, but the warmth they usually brought me was gone. Instead, I kept hearing the same question. If Ethan had truly been sending money for 3 years, where had it gone? The next morning, I followed my normal routine. I brewed a pot of coffee, fed the birds outside my kitchen window, and opened the stack of bills that had arrived the day before. There was the electric bill, the water bill, a reminder from my pharmacy about a prescription refill. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested someone had secretly been providing me with $5,000 every month. I folded each envelope carefully and placed them back in the drawer. For years I had lived this way. Careful, practical, quiet. After Harold passed away, I learned to stretch every dollar farther than I ever thought possible. I stopped replacing things unless they completely stopped working. My living room sofa had a blanket draped over one arm to hide the worn fabric. The refrigerator hummed loudly at night, but it still kept food cold, so I kept using it. When the air conditioner struggled during summer heat waves, I placed a box fan near the window instead of calling a repair service. I never complained. I told myself there were people facing greater hardships. Besides, Ethan was busy. His company had grown faster than anyone expected. News articles occasionally featured him as one of Ohio's most successful entrepreneurs. I kept every clipping in a folder beside my desk. Whenever neighbors asked about him, I smiled proudly and told them how hard he worked. The truth was that our conversations had become less frequent over the years. Not because of arguments. Not because of anger. Life simply seemed to pull him further away. Business trips, meetings, conferences, charity events. Whenever I called, he was always kind, always respectful. Yet somehow there was never enough time. Looking back, I began noticing things that had never seemed important before. Birthday cards that Ethan claimed he mailed, but I never received. Invitations that supposedly got lost. Gifts he mentioned sending that never arrived at my door. At the time, I blamed the postal service or simple mistakes. Now I was no longer certain. Around noon my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. My stomach tightened immediately. "Mom," he said after I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. I barely slept. Neither did I admitted. A long silence followed. "I checked some records this morning," he finally said. "And you were right. Something does not make sense." I gripped the edge of the table. "What did you find?" "Not enough yet, but I need a little more time." His voice lowered. "Mom, I promise you something. I am going to find out exactly what happened." For the first time since Harold died, I heard something in Ethan's voice that I had not heard in years. Determination. Not the confidence of a successful businessman. Not the polished tone he used during interviews. This sounded personal. Deeply personal. As though he was beginning to realize that whatever had happened was bigger than money. After we ended the call, I walked to the front window and watched snow drift across the quiet street. Everything outside looked peaceful. Yet somewhere beneath the surface of our family, hidden beneath years of assumptions and unanswered questions, a secret was beginning to unravel. And for the first time, I felt certain that someone had worked very hard to make sure I never discovered it. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at my house without calling first. That alone told me something was wrong. He had always been considerate, but his schedule usually required planning weeks in advance. When I opened the front door, I immediately noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes. He looked like a man carrying a weight he did not yet understand. He stepped inside, removed his coat, and stood quietly in my living room for a moment. His gaze moved across the familiar furniture, the faded curtains, the old bookshelf Harold had built with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. I watched him take everything in. The worn carpet, the aging recliner, the lamp repaired twice with electrical tape hidden behind the shade. None of it matched the picture he seemed to have carried in his mind. "Mom," he said finally, his voice low. "I need you to answer something honestly." I nodded. "Of course." He looked around again. "Has it really been this hard?" The question caught me off guard. For a second I considered giving the same answer I had given for years. The polite answer. The answer mothers often give their children. "Everything is fine. Do not worry about me." But something about the past 24 hours had changed that. Some months were harder than others, I admitted. Ethan sat down slowly. "Why did you never tell me?" I smiled sadly. "You were building a company. You were traveling constantly. Every time we spoke, you sounded exhausted. I did not want to become another problem you had to solve." He lowered his eyes. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Then he pulled a folder from his briefcase. I spent all morning reviewing records. My stomach tightened. He opened the folder across my coffee table. Inside were printed bank statements, transfer confirmations, and account summaries. Line after line showed the same monthly transaction. $5,000. Every month. For 3 years. The amount alone was difficult to comprehend. I calculated quickly in my head. More money than I had earned in several years combined. Money that could have replaced my roof when it leaked. Money that could have covered medical expenses. Money that could have allowed me to sleep without worrying about every unexpected bill. "The transfers happened," Ethan said quietly. "I can prove that. I studied the papers." "Then where did they go?" He rubbed his forehead. That is the problem. He pointed to a page. The account receiving the money is listed under your name. My confusion deepened. That is impossible. I know. He slid another document toward me. Because this account was never connected to any of your existing banking records. My heart began to beat faster. Someone had created an account using my identity. Someone had been receiving money intended for me. The realization felt unreal. Like discovering a stranger had been living inside your house without your knowledge. Ethan continued turning pages. The more he explained, the less sense it made. Addresses I had never used. Contact information that did not belong to me. Documents linked to locations I had never visited. Every answer created two new questions. Then I noticed something. One address appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork. I recognized it immediately. It was not my address. It was Ethan and Vanessa's former address from several years earlier. Ethan noticed my expression. His eyes followed mine down to the page. The room became completely silent. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he leaned back slowly. The color drained from his face exactly as it had drained from Vanessa's face at the Christmas party. For the first time, neither of us needed to say what we were thinking. Because the same possibility had entered both our minds at the exact same moment, and neither of us was ready to speak it aloud. After Ethan left that afternoon, I remained seated in the same chair for nearly an hour, staring at the stack of documents spread across my coffee table. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the wall clock Harold had bought during our 25th wedding anniversary trip. Normally the sound was comforting. That day it felt louder than usual, as though each second carried another unanswered question. I picked up one of the bank statements again and studied the address that had appeared so many times. Ethan and Vanessa's former home, the place where they had lived during the early years of their marriage. Back then, I visited often. Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, small family gatherings. I remembered carrying homemade casseroles through the front door and helping decorate for Christmas. I remembered believing I was welcome there. Yet now that address seemed connected to something entirely different. Something hidden. Something neither Ethan nor I had noticed. As the afternoon faded into evening, memories began surfacing one by one. At first they seemed insignificant. Small moments I had dismissed years ago. Then the pattern became harder to ignore. I remembered a birthday card Ethan claimed he had mailed with a gift card enclosed. It never arrived. Vanessa had laughed and blamed the postal service. Another time Ethan asked whether I enjoyed the new tablet he had sent for Mother's Day. I told him it never came. Vanessa immediately explained. That porch thieves had probably taken it. There was always an explanation. Always a reason. Always something that prevented deeper questions. At the time I accepted those answers because trust came naturally to me. Families trusted one another. At least I believe they did. Around 6 o'clock my phone buzzed with a text message from Ethan. It was brief. I found something else. Can I come by tomorrow morning? My stomach tightened immediately. Whatever he had found, it was serious enough that he did not want to discuss it over the phone. I replied with a simple yes and spent the rest of the evening trying unsuccessfully to distract myself. I watched an old movie. I made tea. I read several pages of a novel without absorbing a single sentence. My thoughts always returned to the same place. Vanessa's reaction at the Christmas party. The panic in her eyes. The urgency in her voice when she tried to stop the conversation. By bedtime, I realized something that unsettled me even more than the missing money. If Vanessa had been involved, she had been hiding it for years. Not days. Not weeks. Years. The next morning, Ethan arrived before 9 o'clock, carrying another folder. He looked even more exhausted than before. We sat at the kitchen table while sunlight filtered through the curtains. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he opened the folder and slid a document toward me. I hired a forensic accountant last night, he said quietly. My eyes moved down the page. There were account numbers, transaction histories, and records I barely understood. But one detail stood out immediately. The account receiving the monthly transfers had been opened less than 2 weeks before the first payment was sent. Ethan pointed to a line near the bottom. Look at the emergency contact. I adjusted my reading glasses and focused on the name. My heart seemed to stop. Vanessa Wilson. Not hidden behind layers of paperwork. Not buried in complicated financial language. Her name was right there in plain sight. Neither Ethan nor I spoke for several seconds. Outside, snow drifted gently across the yard. Inside, the truth was beginning to emerge piece by piece. And with every new document, it Became harder to believe that any of this had happened by accident. For the rest of that morning, neither Ethan nor I talked much. There was very little left to say. The evidence sitting on my kitchen table spoke loudly enough on its own. I watched my son stare through the window at the falling snow, his expression distant and troubled. For years he had believed he was helping me. For years I had believed he was simply too busy to notice how difficult life had become. Both of us had been living inside completely different versions of reality. Around noon, Ethan finally stood and began gathering the documents. Then he stopped suddenly and looked at me. "There is something else," he said quietly. The tone of his voice made my stomach tighten immediately. He removed another sheet from the folder and placed it in front of me. It was a change of address form. At first, I did not understand why it mattered. Then I saw my name. My full legal name. Margaret and Wilson. According to the document, 3 years earlier, all mail connected to the account had been redirected away from my home. The forwarding address was one I recognized instantly. Ethan and Vanessa's former residence. I felt a chill move through me. Suddenly, dozens of small mysteries from the past several years began fitting together. Missing statements. Missing tax documents. Missing letters. Even the occasional birthday card Ethan claimed he had mailed. None of those things had simply vanished. Someone had made sure they never reached me. Ethan rubbed his forehead and exhaled slowly. The accountant believes whoever opened the account also controlled all correspondence connected to it. I nodded slowly, unable to take my eyes off the paper. Which means they always knew exactly what was happening. Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. The silence was answer enough. Later that afternoon, he left to meet with the accountant again. After the front door closed, I sat alone in the quiet house and allowed myself to remember. Not the missing money, the missing moments. There had been times when Ethan seemed confused during our conversations. Times when he asked whether I liked something he had supposedly sent. Times when he seemed surprised by my financial struggles. I remembered dismissing those reactions because I never wanted to create tension between him and Vanessa. Looking back now, I wondered how many warning signs I had ignored. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang unexpectedly. The caller was a woman named Linda Matthews. At first, the name meant nothing to me. Then she introduced herself as a retired administrative assistant who had worked for Ethan's company several years earlier. My heart immediately began beating faster. "I hope I am not intruding," she said gently. "Mr. Wilson contacted me this morning and asked whether I remembered anything unusual regarding some financial paperwork." I sat down immediately. "Did you?" There was a pause. At the time, I thought it was harmless. But now I am not so sure. Linda explained that several years earlier she had occasionally prepared documents related to the monthly transfers. Normally those records would have been reviewed directly by Ethan. However, Vanessa frequently requested copies before they reached him. She always said she was helping organize household finances, Linda explained. It seemed perfectly reasonable back then. My grip tightened around the phone. Was there anything else? Another pause followed. There was one incident I never forgot. A package arrived addressed to you. Vanessa personally picked it up from reception and told me she would make sure you received it. My heart sank. I never did. Linda sighed softly. I was afraid you might say that. After the call ended, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, another piece of the truth had quietly fallen into place. And for the first time since this investigation began, I realized something even more painful than the money itself. This had not been one mistake. It had not been one bad decision. It had been a pattern repeated again and again for years, hidden behind smiles, explanations, and carefully constructed appearances. The next 2 days passed in a strange silence. Ethan and I spoke several times, but our conversations were shorter now, more focused. The shock was fading, replaced by something colder. We were no longer asking whether something had happened. We were trying to understand how far it went. On the third morning, Ethan called before sunrise. I could tell immediately that he had not slept. His voice carried the weight of someone whose entire understanding of the past few years was beginning to crumble. "Mom, I need you to meet me at my office this afternoon." I sat up in bed. "Did you find something?" There was a pause. "Yes, more than I expected." The hours until our meeting felt unusually long. I tried reading. I watered my plants. I even attempted to organize a closet that had not been touched in years. Nothing distracted me for very long. By 1 o'clock, I was driving toward downtown Columbus through streets still lined with Christmas decorations. The city looked cheerful. Store windows displayed holiday sales. Families carried shopping bags along the sidewalks. Yet I felt as though I was moving through a completely different world. Ethan's office occupied the top floor of a modern glass building overlooking the river. I had visited only twice before. When I arrived, his assistant escorted me directly to a private conference room. Ethan was already there. Beside him sat a gray-haired man wearing reading glasses and a navy suit. He introduced himself as Richard Collins, the forensic accountant Ethan had hired. The table in front of them was covered with documents. Far more documents than I had seen before. Richard opened a folder and began explaining what they had uncovered. The account receiving the monthly transfers had not simply collected money. It had also received occasional deposits connected to gifts, reimbursements, and special transfers Ethan believed were benefiting me. Holiday gifts, birthday gifts, medical assistance, home repair funds. Every year additional money had quietly flowed into the same account. I listened without speaking. The numbers no longer shocked me. What shocked me was the consistency. Year after year, month after month, the pattern never changed. Richard turned another page. There is something else you should see. He slid a printed email across the table. The message had been sent nearly 2 years earlier. Ethan stared at it as though he had never seen it before. I have never received this, he said. Richard nodded. That is because it was deleted from the company archive after being forwarded. My eyes moved across the page. The email had been written by a bank representative requesting identity verification related to the account. The response came from an address associated with Vanessa. The room became completely silent. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. His face looked older than it had only a week earlier. Not because of time, because of disappointment. The accountant continued explaining technical details, but my attention drifted toward the large window overlooking the city. I found myself remembering small moments from the past. Vanessa insisting she would handle paperwork. Vanessa volunteering to organize family finances. Vanessa always positioning herself between information and the people who needed it. None of those actions had seemed suspicious at the time. In fact, many of them had appeared helpful. That realization hurt more than I expected. Trust rarely disappears all at once. It erodes quietly, one unnoticed moment at a time. When the meeting finally ended, Richard gathered his papers and left us alone. Ethan remained seated. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me and asked a question I never expected to hear. Mom, how many times did you need help and decide not to ask me? I looked down at my hands. The answer was impossible to count. The furnace repair I postponed. The dental work I delayed. The medications I stretched longer than recommended. The countless decisions made quietly because I believed I had no other choice. Ethan closed his eyes. The pain on his face had nothing to do with money anymore. He was beginning to understand that the missing funds were only part of the story. The real loss was measured in years. Years of misunderstandings. Years of distance. Years that neither of us could ever get back. And somewhere beyond those missing years, the truth was still waiting for us. 3 days later, the final piece arrived when none of us expected it. I was sitting in my living room sorting through old photographs when Ethan called. His voice sounded different. Not shocked. Not angry. Certain. Mom, I need you to come to the office again. Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from him in the same conference room overlooking the river. This time there were fewer documents on the table. Just one folder. One laptop. One printed report. Ethan looked exhausted, but there was a calmness in his expression that had not been there before. The uncertainty was gone. Richard Collins sat beside him and opened the report. We found the secondary account, he said. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. For weeks we had been following one trail after another, uncovering pieces of a puzzle that never seemed complete. Now it sounded as though someone had finally found the missing corner piece. Richard turned several pages and pointed to a list of transactions. The account receiving Ethan's transfers had not held the money for long. Every month, within days of receiving the deposit, most of the funds were moved elsewhere. Sometimes the transfers were small. Sometimes they were large. But they always led to the same destination. A private investment account. My eyes moved down the page. The account holder's name appeared in bold letters. Vanessa Wilson. No aliases. No complicated ownership structures. Just her name. directly connected to years of transfers. For several moments, nobody spoke. After everything we had uncovered, I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. Deeply tired. The truth was finally visible, yet it brought no satisfaction. Only sadness. Ethan stared at the report without blinking. How much? He finally asked. Richard adjusted his glasses. Including the monthly transfers, redirected gifts, reimbursements, and investment growth, the total exceeds $400,000. The number hung in the air. $400,000. Enough to change a person's life. Enough to solve problems that had weighed on me for years. Enough to explain why opportunities seemed to disappear before they ever reached me. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. I could see the realization settling over him. This was no longer a misunderstanding. No longer a bookkeeping error. The evidence had become impossible to explain away. Richard then opened the laptop and displayed a series of archived communications recovered from old company backups. One message immediately caught my attention. It had been written nearly 3 years earlier. Vanessa had instructed a bank representative to direct all correspondence related to the account to her personal email address. Another message confirmed receipt of account statements. Another discussed investment options. The pattern was undeniable. She had not stumbled into the situation accidentally. She had actively managed it. Carefully. Consistently. For years. Ethan closed the laptop screen. The sound echoed through the quiet room. Does she know? I asked softly. He shook his head. Not yet. Outside the conference room window, the winter sun was beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the river below. The city lights slowly flickered on one by one. I found myself watching them instead of looking at the documents. Because the investigation was no longer the most important thing. The truth had already been found. What mattered now was what came next. Ethan sat silently for several minutes before finally speaking. I keep replaying every conversation we had about you. His voice cracked slightly. Every time you said things were fine. Every time I assumed you were comfortable. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You believed you were helping me. He lowered his eyes. I should have checked. Maybe, I said gently. But trust is supposed to make checking unnecessary. Neither of us spoke after that. The room grew darker as evening settled outside. The documents remained on the table between us, no longer clues, but answers. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I realized the search was over. The truth was no longer hiding. It was waiting. And very soon, the person who had spent years controlling the story was going to learn that everyone else finally knew it too. 2 evenings later, Ethan invited Vanessa to a private dinner at their home. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. The holiday decorations were still up. Soft music played in the background. A fire glowed in the stone fireplace. To anyone looking from the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary winter evening between husband and wife. What Vanessa did not know was that earlier that afternoon, Ethan and I had spent several hours reviewing every document one final time. There were no missing pieces anymore. No unanswered questions. The truth was complete. Around 7 o'clock, Ethan called me from the dining room. He placed the phone on speaker and set it quietly on a nearby table. I listened from my living room while saying nothing. At first, the conversation was casual. They discussed holiday plans, work schedules, small details of everyday life. Then Ethan asked a simple question. Do you remember the account that was created a few years ago for my mother's support payments? The room fell silent. Even through the phone, I could feel the change in the atmosphere. Vanessa responded carefully. Not really. What? Ethan's voice remained calm. Because I have been reviewing old financial records. Another pause followed. That sounds like business, she replied lightly. You always hated paperwork. Ethan did not laugh. I found something interesting. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then Vanessa began offering explanations before he had even asked a question. She mentioned administrative errors, bank confusion, clerical mistakes. She spoke quickly, moving from one possibility to another. Listening from my house, I realized something important. Innocent people usually wait to hear the accusation before defending themselves. Vanessa was defending herself before any accusation had been made. Ethan remained remarkably composed, with the same calm tone he had used all evening. The account was connected to your information. Another pause. Longer this time. That cannot be right. We have the records. More silence. I sat perfectly still in my chair, listening to every word. Outside my window, Snow drifted gently beneath the streetlights. Inside my home, years of confusion were slowly being replaced by clarity. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes. Vanessa changed explanations several times. First, she suggested administrative mistakes. Then she claimed she had been helping organize finances. Later, she insisted she barely remembered the account at all. Each explanation contradicted the one before it. Ethan never raised his voice. He never argued. He simply presented one fact after another. Documents, emails, account records, archived communications. Eventually, the room on the other end of the phone became completely quiet. For nearly a full minute, neither person spoke. Finally, Ethan asked one final question. Why? His voice was barely above a whisper. There was no anger in it, only disappointment. The answer that followed was not dramatic. It was not explosive. It was simply sad. Vanessa admitted that what began as a temporary decision had become something she never knew how to undo. 1 month became another, then another. The money accumulated. The truth became harder to reveal. Years passed. Listening to her explanation, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep sense of loss. Because no amount of money could explain away the years of choices that followed. When the call finally ended, Ethan called me back directly. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said the words I never expected to hear. "Mom, it is over. There are no more secrets." And for the first time since that Christmas gathering, I believed him. 1 year later, Christmas arrived again, but everything felt different. Not because my life had suddenly become perfect. Not because the past had been erased. Some things can never be fully repaired. Trust, once broken, leaves a mark. Yet as I stood in my kitchen that December morning, watching fresh snow settle across the backyard, I realized that peace does not come from forgetting. It comes from finally seeing the truth clearly. The old furnace had been replaced months earlier. The roof no longer leaked during heavy rain. The stack of unpaid bills that once sat in my desk drawer had disappeared. Ethan insisted on helping me make the repairs I had postponed for years. Our way back to each other. As the evening grew darker, Ethan handed me a small envelope. Inside was a simple photograph taken earlier that year. It showed the two of us standing beside the river after lunch one afternoon. We were both smiling. No special occasion. No celebration. Just a quiet moment between a mother and her son. On the back, he had written a single sentence. "Thank you for never giving up on me." I felt tears gather in my eyes. Not tears of sadness. Tears of relief. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not dramatic. They are not loud. They do not happen in courtrooms or boardrooms or public confrontations. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply getting your family back. Later that night, after Ethan drove home, I turned off the lights and stood alone beside the Christmas tree. Snow continued falling outside. The house was quiet, peaceful. For a long moment, I looked at the photograph in my hands and thought about everything that had happened. The missing money, the years of confusion, the painful discoveries, the difficult truths. Then I placed the photograph on the mantel beside Harold's picture and smiled. In the end, the money was never the thing I missed most. What I missed was connection, trust, family. And after all those years, those were the things I finally got back.